We had the big F175 event in London, which was liveries and no new cars. And then when we did start to see some of the new cars, they looked very much like the old cars, Red Bull in particular, but they weren't unique. The changes this year are much more subtle because everyone's starting to converge upon the same ideas. And no one has really come up with any one big particular new idea, which is what we would expect. There's a couple of quite interesting things out there that you wouldn't have expected, but nothing of the kind of the F Dux double diffuser level of exciting innovation. So I think this year is about everyone just getting all the details right and then just planning their year as well as they can to get the performance, to get the championship result that they were looking for. And it's almost impossible to predict, even though people seem to feel that there are some favourites there. I think it's going to be a year of lots of changes, very much like it was last year after Miami, where for the rest of the year, really, you just didn't know who was going to be quick when and how the championship was going to pan out. So I think we're in for actually an exciting year on track and around the paddock. Maybe not so much in the pit lane. The main thing is that everyone's kind of converging on the same sort of solutions. So, in terms of the nose, the front suspension, the side pod shapes, the floor shapes, even the diffuser shapes to an extent. Nothing really there we've seen turn up that we haven't seen previously. Everyone's kind of trying everyone else's ideas. The one true innovation that I saw here was actually from McLaren. It took me a couple of days to work it out. I knew something was going on. So you probably were, if you don't remember, last year McLaren actually changed the position of the steering rack. So the steering rack and the track rod arms that go out for suspension are actually quite an important part of the aerodynamics of the front of these cars because it creates downwash and feeds flow into the floor. Last year, McLaren moved the track rod arms from in front of the lower suspension to behind it. And this actually meant that they could mount them slightly lower and cascade them with a wishbone and actually create lots of flow to go down into the floor. This is really quite clever and quite easy, relatively easy to package within the current Formula One cars because the nose is so long on these cars. Funnily enough, Mercedes have copied that solution this year, but McLaren have gone a step further. They've actually moved the steering rack ever so slightly forwards. So rather than being behind the lower wishbone now, it's now in between the two legs of the lower wishbone. And rather than just having the track rod go outwards like you would almost see on every race car ever, the track rods go diagonally forwards and actually go across the center line of the front wheels and then actually steer the wheels from the front half of the upright. So it's steering that way. And this isn't anything to do with steering geometry or the term anti-dive that everyone seems to apply to the suspension setup. It's actually all to do with aerodynamics and moving this wishbone arms or these track rod arms to be leaning forwards in plan view like this. You end up with a very long piece of surface area in which to create downwash to make the floor work better. Now, this isn't anything anyone can now copy at this stage of the season. It just isn't economically or practically viable to reconstruct your chassis. So they've got a small aerodynamic advantage by making this change. And it'll be interesting to see if that is something that maybe does follow into the future regulations because it is, something that we've never really seen before.
Do you think it will have any impact on rigidity, perhaps at the wheel end of the track rods, and also steering lock? Thinking of the tight hairpins at Monaco, for example.
Well, I think that's clearly the first thing that most of us will think of, and you would have to think that the engineering team at McLaren had thought of this. I know it's been a big challenge. It was laid onto the chassis team by the aero team, so it's, as I say, it's very much aero led. But yes, those arms could be quite susceptible, particularly from wheel to wheel contact or any touch with the walls because you've got a real oblique angle. It would either break the track rod or it could actually lock up the steering because you've got this angular load going into the steering rack. And you would have thought when they designed this, they thought as Monaco was like, what's the worst case scenario in terms of steering through the year? So I think McLaren would have worked this through. I doubt we're going to see any repercussions from this unless they have made a mistake. I think they would have engineered this properly. So it's a big thing to do in the last year of a set of regulations. But then again, McLaren really want that that championship win, for the drivers as well as the constructors.
Would this require, specifically for that, would this have required a new chassis to do? Or could you have adapted
Yeah,
last year's car for
yeah,
this?
no, because the load's going into the steering rack now on a different position, and we've seen that they've got this really quite extreme inclination of the wishbones, which was the first thing everyone noticed with the new McLaren. They'd have had to have certainly re-engineered the front end of the chassis in which to do that. And again, which is why I say no one could really kind of go back and copy this. I don't think them engineering changes are particularly difficult, but it's just something that they would have had to do in order to get this package. They just couldn't, like Williams run an old chassis for a second year. There is like kind of almost nothing in the regulations. We will have the front wing flexibility check test coming in at Monaco, but that's something completely different. No, it's quite possible regulatory wise and even performance wise to run an old chassis. And I believe Williams have, but the caveat remembering is that Williams made a big update to that car mid-season last year. They changed the roll structure, they changed various bits and pieces of the car to make it lighter and to make the aerodynamics work better. So Williams had kind of invested last year into this year's chassis. So it's, almost like not quite, it was more like a B spec of what they started out last year with, rather than completely running a proper 1-year-old chassis. Ferrari had quite a good year last year, and looking at the things they were good at, the car was obviously very quick. They seem to be much better on tyre management, maybe sometimes not so good on strategy. They still fell down on that a few times, but equally, there were times they pulled the strategy out. But really, the weakness of that car was very much in the faster corners. It had great low speed performances, as we saw at Monaco and a few other races. But it just doesn't have the downforce to carry the car through faster corners and still look after its tyres. And looking at testing results, I'm not sure if they've achieved that yet. They've made changes to the car. They've switched to the pull rod front suspension. They've gone to a McLaren style side pod, if we can call it like that, where you have the little winglets sticking out and the whole side pod is much narrower. So you're managing tyre weight with those little wings sticking out the side pod rather than just a big bulky side pod, which should reduce drag, which means you should be able to run more downforce. But again, I mean, Bahrain isn't the greatest place to go testing with Formula One cars, unfortunately. It's a really limited track. It's really only the second sector that really challenges the chassis. Everything else is pretty much, long straights. So we're not sure. But, Ferrari are looking quick, as they have done. So we just need to make sure that, one, that they can maintain that, tyre management, and two, that they can improve the downforce levels to improve high speed corner performance. I think the other thing Ferrari have got to get right this year is what I joked the other day is the biological side, is managing these two drivers and the strategy and the management all around that, because I think that is going to be a big challenge for them this year. We know Ferrari don't tend to communicate very well over the radio during races. Often you'll find the drivers quite frustrated, and I do wonder how Lewis will cope with the Ferrari way of running a race compared with what he's been used to with, Bono and everyone else at Mercedes. So I think that's something that they really need to kind of work on as well this year if they're going to get a result. And I think for Ferrari, the aim has to be constructors for this year. I think everyone must be chasing constructors, perhaps except for Red Bull, who I think would probably be happy to take another drivers' championship, particularly bearing in mind that the limitations that will place on wind tunnel testing as you go into 2026, I think that could be quite attractive, not to do quite so well in constructors, but to come away with the big prize. But yeah, Ferrari, don't want to jump on the hype train too soon, but I think that, they are certainly, in the top two at this stage. And it'd be interesting to see if it really is a top three throughout the season. Strangest thing is when they released the 2025 car, I wasn't actually convinced if it was just Red Bull showing us another, repainted old car. But it was the RB21. The visible changes at this stage are very subtle, just knocking out some of the odd things that they had on last year's car. Still running very much with the late 2024 package. We know that they're going to bring some updates over the first few races, as most teams will. So you think, well, did they need to work a bit harder? Well, They had their problem mid-season last year. We know that they had problems post Miami, and there's lots of conjecture whether that was a braking device or if it wasn't. I think we both have our own opinions on that. And then they had some problems with just in the general balance and performance of the car, how peaky it was. Now, by the end of the season, they seem to have recovered all of that situation and seem to be winning. So maybe they'd worked out what they needed, didn't feel they needed to make a big visual jump with this year's car. The only thing that I've noticed that's quite interesting with the Red Bull is that it looks like they've changed their intercoolers. So you have the turbocharger on the back of these cars, and the air coming out of the turbocharger before it goes back into the engine needs to be cooled down. So you have a radiator called a charge air cooler or an intercooler. Every boy racer has it sticking out the front grille of their road car. And Red Bull have always run what we call air-to-air intercoolers, which is basically like a conventional radiator. Air passes through the radiator in the side pod, and then the hot charge air passes through inside to cool it down. These are quite light but quite bulky aerodynamically. Other teams have used what we call a water to air, so where the charge air is now passing through the tubes, but those tubes are cooled by a water jacket. And teams have been using very clever 3D printed ones, which reduce the size of the intercooler. What this then translates to is a much smaller package, but is much more expensive. This year, it looks like Red Bull have still got the intercoolers in their side pods, but strangely, they look like they're water to air ones, but in the old fashioned style. Now, this means that these may be slightly bulkier, slightly heavier, but much cheaper. But it does give them a bit of freedom with the future aerodynamics at the back of the car. So it just looks like they're taking a much more rational approach to where they're spending the money, where they're putting the development money into, which again just kind of gives us a little tell as to what Red Bull are thinking about for this year, particularly looking forwards to 2026 as well, where they don't want to lose any of the advantage they've had under these current regulations. The Mercedes is another one of the quite changed cars. They've played about with some of the concepts on the car. Nothing too radical. Some side pod changes, a little bit on the nose that they've been playing around with, as most people are, going to that McLaren style track rod setup. And so far, I don't think they've found the performance they're looking for, but the car certainly looks a lot happier than it has done for the past few years. So again, we have to remember that Mercedes have come back from a stage where they've not really got the car to work in these new regulations with the tyres, with the suspension, and with these aerodynamics, particularly low ride heights. So I think, again, with a caveat, it's very early, but it does look like Mercedes have got these fundamental problems solved. And if they have, then they can then start to work on. So I think they might be a bit of a late bloomer this year. As I said, it's very hard to predict how the championship will go. I don't think Mercedes may necessarily have performance in these early races, but certainly as the year goes on and they are confident that they have these fundamental issues sorted out, that they can start to add the real performance to this car. And as we saw last year, when that car works, it's incredibly quick. But they just, they can't get that car to work at every track. So I think that's the challenge for them. And so far, things are looking optimistic on that front. I think a lot of people have made a lot of noise about Adrian at Aston. We have to remember that I think he actually only starts literally as we speak. And as much as there may have been some background conversations, I don't think he'd have had any influence on this car. And even in his first year, I'd be surprised if he has any involvement with the current car. I'm sure that he'll pass his advice over, but I don't think he'll work too hard on it. But you do have the car, and one of the things that everyone has picked up on are these two little inlets next to the cockpit headrest padding between the halo and these little fins. Everyone got quite excited about these during testing, calling them innovative and a radical new idea. And I'd like to just calm those conversations down. It's not massively important. You've got lots of strange airflows and air pressures building up around the halo and the headrest padding, as Red Bull played with last year, as lots of teams have played with fins and bits and pieces. These little inlets, I'd be surprised if they actually cool anything specifically. I think they just pass back into the engine compartment, and they're just a bit of pressure management on the airflow around the cockpit rather than, some super important piece of development. So other than that, generally, the Aston looks a a solid design. I don't see any problems with it. Their testing performance maybe didn't set the world on fire, but the car looked okay. We're quite used to seeing them have quite a good start to the year and then fading, which is quite strangely quite opposite to what we had when they were there, what we maybe describe as the Force India team and its other things, where they typically came on very strongly through the year. So it'd be interesting to see quite how that Aston pans out over the year. But I think really for them, this is just a year to get through in order to get to 2026 and that new change in regulations with Newey's influence.